Her husband sent thugs to beat her and kicked her out of the house, unaware she was a billionaire. 7 days later, she bought the house and put him behind bars. The sound of strange voices pulled Natalie away from the dinner she was preparing. And when she stepped into the living room wiping her hands on a dish towel, she found 3 massive thugs standing near the sofa while her husband Armstrong sat in his favorite chair beside the fireplace, swirling bourbon in a crystal glass as his eyes tracked the strangers with the focused attention of someone who had been expecting them. Before she could form the question rising in her throat, the nearest thug moved with startling speed, his fist connecting with her face in an explosion of pain that split her lip and sent her stumbling backward into the bookshelf, novels and photographs raining down around her as her legs tried to remember how to support her weight. "Armstrong!" she screamed, her voice breaking with terror and confusion. But her husband merely glanced up from his bourbon for half a second before returning his attention to the amber liquid swirling in his glass. And that moment of indifference was somehow more devastating than the violence itself. The tallest thug grabbed her by the throat and lifted her off the ground, her feet dangling above the carpet she had vacuumed just that morning, and his companions moved in from either side with fists that knew exactly where to strike to cause maximum pain without leaving the kind of damage that would raise too many questions later. She tried to scream Armstrong's name again, but the hand crushing her windpipe allowed only choking sounds to escape, and when the thug finally released her and she collapsed, gasping to the floor, the others were already there, their boots finding her ribs with systematic precision, while Armstrong leaned back in his chair and checked something on his phone. The thugs surrounded her with coordinated movements that suggested this wasn't their first time performing this particular service, and their fists and boots began working methodically across her body while she begged Armstrong to help her, to stop them, to do something besides sit there watching with the calm expression of a man observing clouds drift across the sky. The beating continued until her body forgot how to distinguish one source of pain from another, and everything merged into a single overwhelming blanket of agony. And through the forest of legs surrounding her, she caught glimpses of Armstrong in his chair, sometimes watching the violence he had orchestrated, sometimes checking his phone, always maintaining that terrifying stillness. When the assault finally paused, the thugs grabbed her by the ankles and dragged her across hardwood floors that suddenly felt foreign beneath her broken body, her body leaving wet streaks across surfaces she had cleaned just yesterday. And as they hauled her past Armstrong's chair, she reached out toward her husband one desperate final time. He shifted his legs to avoid her bloodied hand touching his pants, his movement casual and unhurried. And that small gesture of revulsion told Natalie everything she needed to know about what their marriage had actually been beneath all the smiles and promises. The thugs kicked her through the doorway and down stone steps that rushed up to meet her face, and her body became briefly airborne before gravity reclaimed her and slammed her against the cobblestone driveway, and she lay there gasping like a fish, drowning in air, while above her, the men disappeared back into the house. She heard crashing sounds from inside, drawers being yanked open, closet doors slamming, and then her belongings began raining down around her broken form, suitcases tumbling down the steps, her clothes sailing through the air like defeated flags, her shoes scattered across the driveway, everything she owned being expelled from the house as thoroughly as she had been expelled from her marriage. The thugs emerged one final time, carrying her last suitcase, and kicked it down the steps where it burst open on impact, spilling her most personal possessions across the cobblestones in a humiliating display. And then they climbed into their vehicle and drove away into the night, leaving her surrounded by the wreckage of her life. She lay there staring up at stars that swam and multiplied, listening to the SUV engine fading into the darkness, and through the large front windows, she could see Armstrong standing now, stretching as though he had been sitting too long, moving toward the kitchen with the relaxed gait of someone whose evening had gone exactly according to plan. Natalie's phone was pressed uncomfortably against her hip, and extracting it required movements that sent fresh waves of agony radiating through her broken body. But eventually, her trembling fingers managed to pull it free and navigate to a contact Armstrong had seen in her phone countless times without ever bothering to ask who it belonged to. The voice that answered after one ring spoke her name with concern, and Natalie managed to whisper 3 words that set in motion events Armstrong couldn't imagine. Even in his most paranoid moments, she pushed herself up from the cobblestones with agonizing slowness, every muscle protesting, every nerve screaming. But she managed to stand on legs that shook like branches in a storm, leaving behind the scattered belongings that no longer mattered, and began limping towards the gate. Behind her, the house sat dark and silent, with Armstrong inside moving through rooms, turning off lights one by one, completely unaware that the wife he had just beaten and kicked out was a billionaire, and that she would cost him everything in exactly 7 days. In this story, you'll learn never to judge someone by their current circumstances, because the person you underestimate today might be the one holding all the power tomorrow. Before we continue, kindly hit the subscribe button and tell us where you are watching from. For years earlier, the rain was coming down in sheets when Natalie's umbrella turned inside out on 5th Street. The wind ripping the cheap fabric from the metal frame and leaving her standing soaked on the corner, while commuters rushed past without slowing their stride. She was fumbling with the broken umbrella, trying to decide whether to abandon it in the nearest trash can or attempt repairs she knew wouldn't hold, when someone stepped close enough that she suddenly found herself sheltered under black fabric that blocked the rain hammering down around them. "Looks like you need some help," the man said. And when she looked up, she found herself staring at someone whose suit probably cost more than 3 months of her rent. His smile easy and confident in the way that came naturally to people who'd never had to worry about broken umbrellas or getting soaked on their way to work. "I'm fine, really," Natalie said. But another gust of wind sent rain into her face, and the words sounded unconvincing, even to her own ears. "There's a coffee shop 2 blocks down," he continued, already guiding her gently by the elbow. "Let me at least walk you there before you catch pneumonia." They walked in silence, punctuated only by the sound of rain hammering against his umbrella. And when they reached the coffee shop, he held the door open and ushered her inside, where warmth and the smell of roasted beans wrapped around her like a blanket. "I'm Armstrong," he said, extending his hand once they were both standing in the dry safety of the cafe. "And before you say you're fine again, I'm buying you whatever you want. Consider it payment for letting me play the hero for 5 minutes." Natalie found herself laughing despite being soaked and uncomfortable, and she accepted the latte he bought without asking what she wanted. And somehow, she gave him her number before leaving, even though every instinct told her men who looked like him didn't genuinely interest themselves in women who looked like her. The restaurant where Armstrong took her for their first date had prices on the menu that made Natalie's breath catch. And she'd spent an hour before he picked her up researching the dress code online and pulling together an outfit from thrift store finds that hopefully looked expensive enough to belong. "Tell me about your work," Armstrong said, leaning forward across the candle-lit table with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. "What drew you to marketing?" Natalie started talking about campaigns and strategies and the promotion she'd just received, and Armstrong listened with an attention that made her feel seen in ways she hadn't experienced before. His questions thoughtful, and his interest genuine enough that she forgot to be nervous about the wine he'd ordered that cost more than her weekly grocery budget. "You're wasted in that corporate structure," he said over dessert, his hand reaching across the table to cover hers. "Someone with your ideas should be running the company, not reporting to people who don't appreciate what you bring. The compliment settled warm in her chest, and when he asked if he could see her again, she said yes before he'd even finished the question. 6 months dissolved into a pattern of dinners and walks and conversations that stretched into the early morning hours, and Natalie found herself falling for Armstrong in ways that felt both terrifying and inevitable, like gravity pulling her towards something she couldn't resist, even if she'd wanted to. They were back at that same restaurant where he'd taken her on their first date, when he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. And Natalie's hands flew to her mouth as he opened it to reveal a diamond that caught the candle light and threw rainbows across the white tablecloth. "Marry me," Armstrong said, and tears were already streaming down Natalie's cheeks before she managed to choke out the word yes, while other diners applauded, and the moment felt like stepping into someone else's fairy tale. The wedding came 3 months later in a church filled mostly with Armstrong's friends and business associates, people who smiled politely at Natalie, while their eyes asked questions they were too well-bred to voice about why someone like him had chosen someone like her. Armstrong's hand squeezed hers during the vows, his voice steady and sure as he promised to love and cherish her for better or worse. And Natalie believed every word because she couldn't imagine a future where this man who'd walked her through the rain and bought her coffee and made her feel special would ever be anything except the person standing beside her making these promises. The house on Ashwood Drive rose before them like something from an architectural magazine when Armstrong pulled into the driveway after their honeymoon, all glass and marble, and spaces so vast that Natalie felt her chest tighten with something between awe and anxiety. "Welcome home," Armstrong said, scooping her up to carry her across the threshold, despite her laughing protests that she was too heavy. And he set her down in a foyer with floors so polished she could see her reflection in the marble. "Armstrong, this is too much," she whispered, her voice echoing in the vast space. "I can't afford to help with a mortgage on a place like this." He wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. "You don't need to afford anything. This is our home where we'll build our life together." Natalie leaned back against him and tried to ignore the small voice in her head, whispering that gifts this large always came with strings attached. 3 months passed in a blur of adjusting to married life and learning to navigate spaces that still felt too perfect to touch. And Natalie threw herself into her work at the marketing firm, where she'd just been promoted to senior account manager, with a salary increase that had finally let her pay off the last of her student loans. She was reading on the sofa one evening when Armstrong poured himself bourbon and settled into his chair across from her, his movements carrying a deliberateness that made her look up from her book. "I've been thinking," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. "You should quit your job at the marketing firm." Natalie set down her book slowly, confusion drawing lines across her forehead. "What? Why would I quit? I just got promoted. They're giving me the Henderson account, which is huge for my career." "That's exactly the problem," Armstrong said, his tone carrying the patience of someone explaining obvious concepts to a slow student. "A man in my position needs a wife who can be fully present at home. Someone who can focus on building our family without the distraction of a career, pulling her attention in different directions," he explained, swirling bourbon in his glass, while Natalie's hands had gripped her book hard enough to crease the pages. "Besides, you're good at what you do, and frankly, that makes me uncomfortable. I can't have people thinking my wife is more successful than I am. It reflects poorly on both of us." She'd wanted to argue to point out that her success reflected well on both of them, that 2 incomes were better than one, that she'd worked too hard to simply abandon her career because it made him uncomfortable. But something in Armstrong's expression had suggested this wasn't a discussion but a directive. "What if we need the money?" she'd asked instead, trying a different approach. What if something happens, and we need two incomes to maintain this lifestyle? Armstrong had laughed at that, the sound carrying an edge of condescension that made her stomach tighten with emotions she couldn't quite name. And his response had been delivered with the patience of someone explaining simple concepts to a child who couldn't grasp basic mathematics. "Natalie, I make more than enough to support us both comfortably, and honestly, your salary is barely noticeable in our household budget," he'd said, finishing his bourbon and pouring another measure. "Think of it this way. When we have children, you'll need to be home anyway, so why not start establishing that pattern now? Be a full-time wife, focus on the home, make this house somewhere I actually want to return to after work. What if I don't want to quit?" she asked instead, her voice smaller than she had intended. Armstrong's eyes hardened into something cold and flat. "Then you're choosing your career over our marriage, and we'll need to have a very different conversation about what that means for us going forward." The thread hung in the air between them, and Natalie recognized with sinking certainty that this wasn't a discussion, but a directive dressed up as a request, and arguing would only make things worse. "Can I think about it?" she asked quietly. "There's nothing to think about," Armstrong said, finishing his bourbon in one swallow. "You'll submit your resignation tomorrow, and we can start focusing on what actually matters, building a proper home and family." Natalie submitted her resignation the following week, her hands trembling as she signed the papers that ended a career she'd worked 6 years to build, and her manager had looked at her with confusion and disappointment that made the decision hurt even more. The first month without work felt like drowning in slow motion, her days stretching endlessly, while Armstrong left for the office, and she rattled around the massive house, trying to fill hours with grocery shopping and cleaning spaces that barely needed maintenance, because they were already perfect. She stood in the kitchen one afternoon, staring at the gleaming marble countertops and feeling the walls pressing in on her from all sides, the isolation wrapping around her throat like hands that squeezed tighter with each passing day. Her laptop sat on the counter where she'd left it that morning, and on impulse she opened it and started searching for something, anything that could fill the void where her career used to be. Social media platforms she'd previously ignored for professional networking suddenly looked different through the lens of someone with unlimited time and a growing desperation for purpose. And she found herself falling down rabbit holes of e-commerce tutorials and dropshipping success stories, and people who'd built businesses from their laptops while the world assumed they were doing nothing. By the end of her second month of unemployment, Natalie had registered her first business entity under a name Armstrong would never connect to her, choosing something generic and forgettable that would blend into the background of limited liability companies that existed only on paper. She launched her first drop shipping store, testing products in markets she'd identified through careful research using skills the marketing firm had taught her, but applying them in ways they'd never imagined. And she made her first $1,000 in profit on a Tuesday afternoon while Armstrong was at work, believing his wife was home watching daytime television and planning dinner menus. Month 6 brought the breakthrough that changed everything when a product she'd been testing went viral on social media, orders flooding in faster than she could process them manually. And Natalie hired her first virtual assistant to help manage the workload while keeping everything carefully hidden from Armstrong, who'd started coming home later and later each evening. She worked at Armstrong's home office that he never used. The door closed and her laptop screen angled away from the windows, her wireless earbuds playing white noise that would cover any sound of her voice if she needed to take calls. The business grew with a momentum that felt almost alive, each success funding the next expansion, and Natalie found herself building something that belonged entirely to her in ways her marriage never had. By the end of year 1, she'd built a network of 6 different e-commerce stores, generating consistent 6-figure revenue. and she'd incorporated a holding company to manage the growing complexity, opening business bank accounts Armstrong knew nothing about because he'd never asked how she spent her days, and she'd stopped volunteering information he clearly didn't want to hear. Year 2 became about scaling and diversification, her e-commerce profits, funding real estate investments and stock portfolios and startup ventures. Each deal carefully structured through lawyers who understood that confidentiality wasn't optional, but absolutely mandatory. The numbers climbed higher than Natalie had imagined possible, each milestone feeling surreal and impossible, even as her bank balances confirmed the reality. And by month 18, she'd crossed her first billion in total asset valuation. The 10 billion milestone came on a Thursday afternoon. 6 months ago, the valuation report appearing in her encrypted email while she was stirring pasta sauce on the stove. And Natalie had stared at the number for a full hour trying to process that she'd built in 2 years what most people couldn't build in a lifetime. All of it hidden from the husband who'd insisted she quit working because her success made him uncomfortable, who came home each evening to a wife he believed contributed nothing, who had no idea that the woman serving his dinner had spent her afternoon deciding whether to acquire a struggling manufacturing company or invest in a promising biotech startup. Armstrong had started changing somewhere around the time Natalie's wealth had started its exponential growth, though she told herself the timing was coincidence rather than causation, because he couldn't possibly know what she'd been building. His late nights became more frequent, his attention to her diminishing until some evenings he'd barely acknowledge her presence beyond asking what was for dinner. And Natalie told herself his distance was about work stress rather than admitting what her instincts had been screaming for months. She was taking Armstrong suits to the dry cleaner on a Tuesday morning when she found the hotel receipt in his jacket pocket, the paper folded small, but not small enough to hide the charges that told a story she'd been trying not to see. The Grand Marquis Hotel room service for 2 at 11 p.m. A bottle of champagne that cost more than Armstrong had spent on their anniversary dinner. Charges that appeared on multiple dates, coinciding perfectly with the evenings he told her he was working late. The woman's name on the room service charges was Sarah Mitchell, and a quick search on social media showed Armstrong's secretary, young and beautiful, and posting photos of jewelry and dinners at restaurants Armstrong had never taken his wife to. Natalie confronted him that evening, the receipt laid out on the dining room table like evidence in a trial she hadn't wanted to prosecute. And Armstrong walked in from work to find her sitting there with the paper positioned where he couldn't miss it. "What's this?" he asked, his tone suggesting mild curiosity rather than concern. "You tell me," Natalie said, her voice steadier than her hands. "Because it looks like proof you've been spending nights at hotels with your secretary instead of working late like you've been telling me." Armstrong picked up the receipt and examined it with the mild interest of someone being shown a grocery list. And when he set it back down, his face showed no guilt or shame, only irritation at being inconvenienced. "So you found out?" he said, moving to the bar cart to pour himself bourbon. "Did you really think I'd stay faithful to someone who contributes nothing? You don't work. You don't earn. You just exist in my house spending my money, and you thought that was enough to keep a man like me interested." The cruelty in his words stole Natalie's breath, each syllable landing like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain seated and steady even as her hands trembled in her lap. "I'm your wife," she said quietly. "We made vows for better or worse in sickness and health. If you're unhappy, we should talk about it. Work on our marriage, not betray everything we promised each other." Armstrong laughed, the sound sharp and cutting in the quiet house. "Talk about what, Natalie?" "About how boring you've become. How you've let yourself go. How you have nothing interesting to say because you spend your days doing absolutely nothing. Sarah actually stimulates me intellectually and physically. She has ambition and drive, and doesn't just sit around waiting for me to come home and give her life meaning. Natalie stood slowly, her chair scraping against the floor. If you're so unhappy with me, then maybe we should discuss separation or divorce instead of you sneaking around behind my back. Divorce. Armstrong's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. And give you half of everything I've worked for? I don't think so. If you can't handle me seeing someone who actually adds value to my life, then leave. There's the door. See how well you do without my money supporting you. The dismissal in his tone was absolute, as though her leaving was so impossible, it wasn't worth serious consideration, and something in Natalie's chest hardened into resolve. You want me to just accept that you're cheating and stay in this marriage anyway? She asked. I want you to recognize reality, Armstrong said, draining his bourbon. You have nowhere to go. No income, no prospects. This house, this life, it's all mine. And you're here because I allow it. So yes, you'll accept that I do what I want, and you'll keep playing the devoted wife, because the alternative is you ending up back in whatever sad little apartment you were living in before I rescued you from mediocrity. Natalie stood there for a long moment, her hands clenched at her sides, her mind already running through contingency plans she'd prepared for scenarios exactly like this one. I see, she said finally, and then she turned and walked upstairs without another word, leaving Armstrong alone with his bourbon and his cruelty and his absolute certainty that he held all the power in their marriage. 3 days passed in tense silence, where Armstrong treated Natalie's presence in the house like she was furniture that annoyed him by existing, walking past her without acknowledgement, eating meals she prepared without thanks, sleeping in the guest room because apparently even sharing a bed with her had become intolerable. Natalie spent those 72 hours making encrypted phone calls from Armstrong's unused office, sending coded emails to lawyers and accountants whose contact information was saved in her phone under names so bland that Armstrong had scrolled past them hundreds of times without ever wondering who they actually were. On the 4th day, Armstrong came home at 3:00 p.m. Instead of his usual 7, his face flushed and his movements carrying the aggressive energy of someone who'd made a decision and was ready to execute it. Natalie was in the kitchen preparing vegetables for dinner when she heard the front door slam, and she set down her knife and moved toward the living room to find Armstrong standing in the foyer with his coat still on and his phone already in his hand. I want you gone, he announced without preamble, his words clipped and final. I've tried waiting for you to take the hint and leave on your own, but apparently you're too pathetic to have that much self-respect, so I'm going to help you with the decision. Natalie's heart began hammering against her ribs, but she kept her expression neutral. What are you talking about? I'm done pretending this marriage means anything, and I'm done having you here as a constant reminder of a mistake I made 3 years ago. He lifted the phone to his ear, his eyes never leaving Natalie's face. Yeah, it's Armstrong. That thing we discussed. I need it done tonight. The address is 2847 Ashwood Drive. Bring 2 other guys, and make sure the message is clear. He ended the call and smiled, the expression holding no warmth whatsoever. Armstrong settled into his leather chair beside the fireplace, poured himself bourbon from the decanter on the side table, and looked at Natalie with eyes that had gone cold and dead. The sound of strange voices pulled Natalie away from the kitchen, where she'd been standing frozen since Armstrong made his phone call. And when she stepped into the living room, wiping her trembling hands on a dish towel, she found 3 massive men standing near the sofa while her husband sat in his chair beside the fireplace, swirling bourbon in a crystal glass. Before she could form the question rising in her throat, the nearest man moved with startling speed, his fist connecting with her face in an explosion of pain that split her lip and sent her stumbling backward into the bookshelf. Novels and photographs raining down around her as her legs tried to remember how to support weight. "Armstrong!" she screamed, her voice breaking with terror and confusion, but her husband merely glanced up from his bourbon for half a second before returning his attention to the amber liquid in his glass, and that moment of indifference was somehow more devastating than the violence itself. The tallest man grabbed her throat and lifted her off the ground, her feet dangling above carpet she'd vacuumed just that morning, and his companions moved in from either side with fists that knew exactly where to strike to cause maximum pain without leaving the kind of damage that would raise too many questions later. She tried to scream Armstrong's name again, but the hand crushing her windpipe allowed only choking sounds to escape. Wet gasping noises that didn't sound human. And when the man finally released her and she collapsed to the floor, the others were already there, their boots finding her ribs with systematic precision. "Armstrong, please." She managed to sob between blows, craning her neck to see her husband through the forest of legs surrounding her. "Please make them stop." Armstrong leaned back in his chair and checked something on his phone. The blue light from the screen illuminating his face with an eerie glow, and he didn't look up even when Natalie's screams became more desperate. The beating continued with professional efficiency, the men working in coordinated movements that suggested they'd done this before, their fists and boots finding targets across her body, while she tried uselessly to protect herself, with arms that were quickly becoming too damaged to lift. Through the haze of pain, Natalie caught glimpses of Armstrong in his chair, sometimes watching the violence he'd orchestrated with mild interest, sometimes scrolling through his phone with the casual attention of someone checking social media, always maintaining that terrifying stillness that was somehow worse than if he'd been participating in the assault. Her vision began to blur at the edges, darkness creeping in from the periphery, and she tasted blood filling her mouth and choking her and making it impossible to draw full breaths. "That's enough." Armstrong's voice cut through the sound of her ragged breathing, and the assault paused immediately, as though someone had pressed pause on a video. The men grabbed her by the ankles and began dragging her across hardwood floors that suddenly felt foreign beneath her broken body, her arms trailing uselessly above her head as the living room ceiling slid past her blurred vision. As they hauled her past Armstrong's chair, she reached out toward him one desperate final time, her bloodied hand grasping toward the man she'd married, and he shifted his legs casually to avoid her fingers, touching his pants, the movement unhurried and deliberate. That small gesture of revulsion told Natalie everything she needed to know about what their marriage had actually been beneath all the smiles and promises and moments she believed were real. The men kicked her through the doorway, and her body tumbled down stone steps that rushed up to meet her face, each impact adding new layers of pain to the symphony already consuming her. And she rolled across cobblestones until momentum finally abandoned her near the center of the circular driveway. She lay there gasping like a fish drowning in air, staring up at stars that swam and multiplied above her, and she heard the men's footsteps retreating back into the house with purpose that suggested they weren't finished yet. Crashing sounds echoed from inside, drawers being yanked open, closet doors slamming, the distinctive thud of furniture being overturned, and then her belongings began raining down around her broken form like debris from an explosion. A suitcase tumbled down the steps and landed near her head, spilling clothes across the cobblestones in a humiliating display of everything she owned, being expelled from the house as thoroughly as she'd been expelled from her marriage. Her shoes sailed through the air and scattered across the driveway. Her coats followed and landed in crumpled heaps. Her toiletries and books and the few personal items she'd managed to accumulate during 3 years of marriage all came flying out the door to join her in exile. The men emerged one final time carrying her last suitcase, the heavy one with her winter clothes, and they kicked it down the steps where it burst open on impact, her belongings spreading across the stones like evidence of a life that had just been dismantled. Through the large front windows, Natalie could see Armstrong standing now, stretching as though he'd been sitting too long, and he moved toward the kitchen with the relaxed gait of someone whose evening had gone exactly according to plan. The SUV's engine started somewhere beyond her field of vision, and she listened to the sound of tires crunching away into darkness, leaving her alone on the driveway, surrounded by the wreckage of everything she'd thought her life was. Her phone was pressed uncomfortably against her hip, and extracting it required movements that sent fresh waves of agony radiating through her broken body. But eventually, her trembling fingers managed to pull it free from her pocket. The screen was cracked in a spiderweb pattern that made the display difficult to read, but it still functioned when she swiped it active, and she navigated through contacts with bloodied fingers that left smears across the glass. She found the number for her lawyer, the one Armstrong had never known about, and she pressed dial while her other hand pressed against her ribs to ease the pain that came with each shallow breath. "Help!" she whispered when the voice answered. "I need help. Send someone to pick me up at 2847 Ashwood Drive." The response was immediate questions about her location and her condition, and Natalie gave what details she could through gritted teeth while her eyes stayed fixed on the house where Armstrong's silhouette moved past windows, turning off lights. "Stay where you are," the voice said firmly. "Someone will be there in 15 minutes. Don't try to move." Natalie let the phone fall from her hand and lay back against the cold cobblestone, staring up at stars that seemed impossibly distant, and she listened to the sound of her own ragged breathing mixing with the silence of the night. Headlights appeared at the end of the street sooner than she'd expected. A black sedan pulling up to the curb, and a woman stepped out, moving quickly toward where Natalie lay, surrounded by her scattered belongings. "Miss Natalie," the woman said, crouching beside her and assessing the damage with eyes that had clearly seen trauma before. "I'm Jennifer. We need to get you to a hospital right away." Jennifer's gaze swept across the driveway, taking in the scattered clothes and broken suitcases, and her eyes stopped on something near the curb where the SUV had been parked. She moved quickly to retrieve whatever had caught her attention. And when she returned, she was holding a phone that didn't belong to Natalie. "One of them dropped this," Jennifer said quietly, her fingers swiping across the screen. "It's unlocked." She helped Natalie to her feet with careful efficiency, supporting most of her weight as they moved toward the car. And once Natalie was settled in the back seat, Jennifer climbed into the driver's seat and pulled away from Ashwood Drive. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of street lights and pain, and Natalie watched through half-closed eyes as Jennifer made a phone call while steering with one hand. "This is Jennifer Harrison calling for Detective Morrison," she said into her phone. "I have a victim of felony assault who needs immediate medical attention, and I'm transporting her to St. Mary's Emergency now. We also recovered a phone at the scene that may contain evidence. I need officers to meet us at the hospital." The emergency room staff took over when they arrived, nurses and doctors moving with practiced efficiency. And Natalie found herself on a gurney being wheeled through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and fear. 2 police officers arrived while doctors were examining her injuries, their uniforms crisp and their expressions professional as they pulled out notebooks and began asking questions. Natalie told them everything through waves of pain that made her voice shake. Armstrong's phone call, the 3 men, the beating, while her husband watched, being thrown out with her belongings scattered across the driveway. The officers took photographs of every bruise and cut, documenting the damage with clinical precision. And when they finished, one of them turned to Jennifer, who'd been standing quietly near the door. "You mentioned a phone recovered at the scene," the officer asked. Jennifer pulled the device from her bag and handed it over. One of the assailants dropped this. It was unlocked when I found it. The officer pulled on latex gloves before taking the phone. His partner moving closer to observe as he began scrolling through the device. His expression changed as he navigated to the video app, and he turned the screen so his partner could see whatever had caught his attention. "There's video," he said quietly, his eyes lifting to meet Natalie's. "It shows the entire assault. Your husband sitting in his chair watching, the men beating you, everything." The officer's partner was already on her radio calling for additional units, and what sounded like a supervising detective. Her voice carrying the urgency of someone who'd just discovered evidence that would change everything. "We're going to need a formal statement once you're medically cleared," the first officer said to Natalie. "But based on what's on this phone, we'll be seeking an arrest warrant for your husband on multiple felony charges." Natalie closed her eyes and let the words wash over her while a nurse inserted N4 into her arm. The cool liquid spreading through her veins, bringing relief from pain that had become her entire world. "I want a copy of that video," she said, her voice stronger now despite the medication beginning to take effect. "Before it goes into evidence, I need my own copy." The officers exchanged glances. Then the first one nodded slowly. "We can arrange that. Standard procedure is to make multiple copies for evidence preservation. Anyway, I'll have your copy before we log this phone into the system." Jennifer stepped forward with a thumb drive she'd pulled from somewhere, and the officer took it along with the phone, disappearing into a side room where Natalie could hear him talking with what sounded like a technology specialist. He returned 20 minutes later and handed the thumb drive back to Jennifer. "Certified copy of all video files on that device with chain of custody documentation. The original phone is now entered into evidence for the case we're building against your husband." Natalie took the thumb drive from Jennifer's hand and held it carefully, understanding that this small piece of plastic and metal contained Armstrong's confession recorded by his own hired thugs. Evidence so damning that no lawyer could explain it away. The medication pulled her towards sleep despite her efforts to stay focused. And the last thing she heard before darkness claimed her was one of the officers speaking into his radio about obtaining a warrant for Armstrong's arrest. The hospital room glowed with the blue light from Natalie's laptop screen, and her bandaged fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long moment before she began typing email addresses into the recipient field. Armstrong's boss came first, then the CEO, then every member of the board of directors whose contact information she'd memorized from the company directory Armstrong kept on his home computer, and finally the head of human resources, whose job it was to handle situations exactly like this. She attached the video file to each email, the thumbnail showing a frozen image of Armstrong sitting calmly in his chair while blurred figures surrounded something on the floor, and she typed a single sentence in the body of each message. "This is what your employee, Armstrong Hayes, did to his wife." Her finger hovered over the send button, and Jennifer looked up from the chair by the window where she'd been reviewing documents. "Once you send that, there's no taking it back," Jennifer said quietly. "Good," Natalie replied, and she pressed send. 2 days later, Natalie was eating bland hospital food 2 days later when her phone buzzed with a news alert, and she opened it to find an article about personnel changes at Armstrong's company. Armstrong Hayes, Senior Vice President of Development, has been terminated effective immediately. She read aloud, her voice gaining strength with each word. The company declined to comment on the reasons for his departure, citing personnel matters as confidential. Jennifer looked up from her tablet. That was fast. They had video evidence of him orchestrating a felony assault, Natalie said, setting down her phone. What else could they do? Day 3 brought a visitor Natalie hadn't expected, a private investigator she had hired when she discovered her husband's infidelity, appearing in her hospital room with a folder thick with documents and photographs. Armstrong took out a $2 million personal loan 3 weeks ago. The investigator said, spreading papers across the rolling table. The loan documents show it was for business investment purposes, but the money went to purchase this. He slid a photograph across the table showing a silver Mercedes with a bow on top and another photo showing Sarah Mitchell standing beside it with Armstrong's arm around her shoulders. His secretary, Natalie said flatly. His former secretary. The investigator corrected. She resigned the day Armstrong was fired, moved out of her apartment that same evening, and her phone has been disconnected. Armstrong is left holding a $2 million loan with no job and no way to repay it. Natalie was discharged from the hospital on day 4, and she moved into a penthouse suite with floor-to-ceiling windows that showed the city spreading out below like a map of everything she owned. She was standing at those windows drinking coffee when Jennifer called with news that made her smile for the first time since the assault. Armstrong listed the house, her lawyer said without preamble. 2,847 Ashwood Drive went on the market this morning, asking price $2.2 million. Owner motivated for quick sale. Contact the listing agent, Natalie said, her reflection in the glass showing eyes that had gone hard and cold. Cash offer, full asking price, close in 2 days. Don't reveal who the buyer is. Day 7 arrived with Natalie dressed in a charcoal suit that whispered wealth with every thread, and she walked into the title company conference room with Jennifer and 2 lawyers following behind her like an entourage. Armstrong sat at the long table with his attorney beside him, his suit wrinkled and his face showing the exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept properly in a week. And when he looked up and saw Natalie, his entire body went rigid. "What are you doing here?" The words came out strangled, confused. Natalie pulled out the chair directly across from him and sat down slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. "I'm here for the closing." "The closing?" Armstrong's voice rose with confusion, bordering on panic. "What closing? You're not. You can't be the buyer." Natalie finished folding her hands on the table. "The anonymous LLC that made the cash offer on your house. That's mine. The $2 million you need so desperately also mine." "You're selling your house to me, Armstrong." The color drained from Armstrong's face like water down a drain. And he turned to his lawyer with eyes that begged for this to be some kind of mistake. "This has to be illegal," Armstrong said, his voice shaking. "She can't just, where would she even get?" $2 million, Natalie interrupted, pulling a folder from her briefcase. "That's pocket change. But before we finalize the sale, there's something else you need to sign." She slid the folder across the polished table, and Armstrong opened it with hands that trembled so badly the papers rustled. Divorce papers stared up at him from expensive legal stationery, every clause and provision spelling out the end of their marriage. "Sign them," Natalie said quietly. "Sign the deed transfer, sign the divorce papers, and maybe I'll consider not pursuing additional civil litigation." Armstrong stared at the documents, his breathing shallow and rapid. "You planned all of this. The video going to my office, me losing my job, Sarah leaving. You orchestrated everything." "I sent a video of what you did to the people who employed you," Natalie corrected, her voice never rising above conversational volume. "You're the one who hired thugs to beat your wife unconscious while you sat watching. You destroyed your own life, Armstrong. I just made sure people knew what kind of man you really are. Please." The word came out broken, desperate. "Natalie, please. I made a mistake. I was angry. I didn't mean." "You sat in your chair and watched," Natalie said. And now her voice carried an edge sharp enough to cut. "You moved your legs so my blood wouldn't touch your pants. You had them throw me into the street like garbage. There is no apology sufficient for that. Armstrong's lawyer leaned close and whispered something urgent, and Armstrong's shoulders sagged in defeat as he reached for the pen with a hand that shook. His signature on the divorce papers was barely legible, the letters shaky and uneven. And when he finished the first document, his lawyer pushed the deed transfer papers in front of him. "Just sign," the lawyer said quietly. "There's no other option here." Armstrong signed the deed transfer, each stroke of the pen looking like it caused him physical pain, and he pushed the papers back across the table without meeting Natalie's eyes. The title company representative began applying stamps and seals, the mechanical sounds of bureaucracy making everything official and legally binding. And Natalie was reviewing the completed documents when the conference room door opened. Two police officers entered with badges clipped to their belts and handcuffs hanging ready, and one of them moved to stand directly behind Armstrong's chair. "Armstrong Hayes," the officer said formally. Armstrong's head jerked up, his eyes going wide with panic. "Yes, stand up, please." The officer's tone left no room for argument. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit assault, and assault causing great bodily harm." "What? No, you can't." "I didn't." Armstrong's words tumbled over each other as he rose on unsteady legs. The officer pulled Armstrong's arms behind his back, and the metallic click of handcuffs locking into place echoed through the suddenly silent room. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer began, his voice flat and professional. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you." Armstrong's eyes found Natalie's across the table, and his expression held disbelief and rage, and the dawning understanding that this was real. This was happening. His life was over. "The video shows everything," Natalie said quietly as the officers began guiding Armstrong toward the door. "You sitting there calm as can be while 3 men beat me unconscious. The prosecutor tells me you're looking at 15 to 20 years. Armstrong opened his mouth, but only a choked sound emerged. And then the officers were leading him out of the conference room, his lawyer scrambling to gather documents and calling out that he'd meet Armstrong at the police station. The door closed behind them, and silence settled over the room like dust after an explosion. Jennifer placed a hand on Natalie's shoulder. "It's done. 7 days. Just like you said. 7 days." Natalie repeated, looking down at the deed that made her the legal owner of 2,847 Ashwood Drive. 7 days for him to lose everything: his job, his mistress, his house, his freedom. 7 days for the wife he threw away to become the person who took it all. She stood and gathered her documents, the deed and the divorce papers, and the signed agreements that proved Armstrong had underestimated her so completely it had cost him everything, including his freedom. "The house where he had me beaten is mine now," she said, moving toward the exit. "And he'll spend the next 15 to 20 years in a cell, thinking about what it cost him to throw away a woman whose worth he never bothered to discover." Natalie stepped out into afternoon sunlight that felt warm on her face, and she looked back once at the title company building where Armstrong's life had ended and hers had begun again. 7 days had been exactly enough time for justice to transform from an abstract concept into a concrete reality. And the woman walking away from that building was no longer the broken victim bleeding on cobblestones, but the billionaire who'd proven that patience and plan could defeat violence and arrogance every single time. Dear viewers, within the shadows of suffering often dwells a power so profound that those who inflict pain remain blind to the storm gathering in silence. Never judge someone by their current circumstances, because the person you underestimate today might be the one holding all the power tomorrow. Drop in the comments what lessons you learned, and what you would have done differently if you were Natalie. Subscribe for more captivating educational stories that teach real-life lessons.